Hey there, fellow creators, Ben here from Cineblog Studios, and this week I wanted to talk about pricing your artwork. It's something that a lot of artists, from beginners to professionals, seem to struggle with quite a bit. So today let's have a look at some of the things that I suggest for you to consider. So I just want to start out by saying that this video is strictly tips for pricing your artwork, not a tutorial, not an absolute guide. You don't have to follow this exactly to a T, but it's kind of how I've developed my own sort of pricing system over the years, and they're the things that I consider when putting a price tag on my work. So the first factor to consider is how long did it take to make the project? And I don't necessarily mean brush to canvas time. I mean initial sketch, any kind of finishing work you did, framing, that kind of stuff. So really from the inception of the project all the way through to when you're ready to hang it on a wall, how long did that take, start to finish? Now, you don't necessarily have to be super accurate with this. An estimate will do just fine. But then you want to take that and multiply it to some sort of base hourly pay. Some people might say, well, we'll just go with minimum wage, but minimum wage is really an understatement, especially since artwork is a skilled labor. So we'll go with the average entry-level wage for something like graphic design. So in wherever you happen to live in the world, whatever that is, whatever you're expected to be paid as sort of an entry-level art job. Here in the US, that's going to be somewhere, depending on what state you live in, probably somewhere between $15 and $20 an hour. So if we take that and calculate it out, let's say it's a 18-hour project from start to finish, and 15 an hour, starts us with a base price of $270, and that's without measuring anything else. The next metric to consider would be how large the piece is. Now, for a traditional project, you're going to think, okay, well, how much did the canvas cost? So let's say it's a 16 by 20 canvas. That's probably about 15 or 20 bucks. We'll put that onto our price as well. 20. We're up to 290 now. Now, for a digital piece, you might think, okay, just kind of find a way to calculate that based on either pixel size, inches, or centimeters, depending on how you're setting up your digital file. And yeah, think about like how big is it? Like obviously bigger projects are going to be more expensive, and smaller ones that may be the size of a postcard, less expensive. Next up is your material costs. Now this is something that is not strictly referred to like simply like buying the canvas or buying a tube of paint. Like I was out of white, so we'll factor in maybe that tube of paint for the project. That's not necessarily what I mean. I mean, you bought brushes at some point, you bought all your colors at some point, and you're using a fraction of all of those things as you're working. So you want to factor in a little bit of money for that as well. Now, of course, if you're working digitally, the initial investment for your computer and your tablet, and whatever else you happen to need for that project, factor in a percentage of that as well. If I'm thinking about my acrylic piece, like, well, I used acrylics, so that's a little on the cheaper end compared to something like oils. We can toss in maybe another $10 to $15 calculating for that price. I'll add 10. Next up is something that I actually kind of have a story about, because I changed a price on something recently because of it, is the complexity of the design. Now, I recently did a commission, and on that commission I had a certain concept when I started, but I wasn't quite sure if I was even going to really be able to tackle the project. And by the time I was done, I messaged my client. I said, hey, I got to tack on a few extra dollars for this one, because this ended up being a lot more work, and the design is a lot more complex than I originally thought. Now, I wouldn't normally do that after the fact. I would try and calculate that out beforehand. But if it's not a commission, if you're just doing sort of a singular piece that you're selling outright and then calculating backwards, kind of what we're talking about already, you want to think about, okay, part of that goes into how long it took, but simply how complex was the design? Because I have a lot of smaller pieces that I do that are quick. The designs aren't super complex, so that price point would be lower. But a more elaborate landscape, something, again, much larger, with a lot of different elements, even a lot of different colors, that would factor into the price as well. Since I'm trying to average this out, I'm just going to make this about another $10, $15 onto that price. We'll go 10. Next up, this is, again, something I kind of touched on earlier, but traditional versus digital changes things a little bit. But is the piece framed? Specifically a canvas. Canvas frames tend to be a lot more expensive, And if you're going to either be taking it to a framing shop to get it framed or doing it yourself, that's going to cost money, and that amount of money should also factor into your cost. Now, I don't necessarily frame my stretched canvases, but I do finish the edges, so I kind of take that into my material costs a little bit. For this particular tally, I'm not going to add anything, but it is something to consider. Again, if you're putting a $50, $60 frame on your piece, you want to make that money back, so add that $50 or $60 onto that final price for the piece. Now, for a digital piece that you're not framing, you want to think about what kind of files you're delivering to your client. For example, if I'm doing a logo project, which I've done a handful over the years, I won't just give somebody a single JPEG or a PNG image. I'll usually give somebody a good dozen. Big versions, small versions, transparent background versions. All of those factor into that final presentation cost as well. And the last sort of thing to consider is something that is probably a little bit more subjective, and that's how long have you been selling? How long have you been working, and is your work in any kind of demand? Now, when I first started selling my work almost 10 years ago now, I was selling a 16 by 20 canvas for about 50 or 60 bucks. And over time, as more stuff sold, I kind of got an understanding of what people are looking for, and my own skills have improved as well. I was like, okay, I can start bumping that up a little bit, to a more comfortable and reasonable price that, one, doesn't undervalue my own work, but two, is still something that people can recognize, yeah, that's a bit of money, so there's sort of a mutual back and forth respect between client and artist in that regard. Now, if you're looking to bump up the prices of your work, highly recommend doing it. I think a lot of artists, including myself, tend to undervalue themselves a little bit. Keep in mind, you can always take the price up, but taking the price down can have some interesting consequences. The biggest one here would be that if you cut a price on something, regardless of it's something that you had to do or damage or whatever, but somebody might look at that as, oh, he took the price down. It must really not be worth that much, and you start to have maybe a less of a good rapport with your clientele as a result. And actually, I think I said that was the last one. I just remembered one more that I didn't have written down, and that was the inflation of price to compensate for commissions. So at my local gallery in the art collective I'm in, my art manager takes 30% cut out of everything that's sold out of the gallery. And that's 30% is fairly standard in most galleries. Some are a little bit more, some are a little bit less, depending on where you go. But I will actually change the price a little bit to compensate for that 30% commission. So I'm still making my cut, and he's still taking his cut, and everyone's still getting their cut. But that extra bit of inflation on the price allows me to still make the money that I want to make while still keeping the price a little bit more reasonable. So in this instance, our price point with all of our calculations, we're up to $310. I would probably just take that up another 40 bucks to $350, round it out, and end up with that for, what did I say at the beginning? I think an 18-hour piece. So I think that's a pretty good starter. And again, that price can go up and inflate depending on how confident you are and how much you really want to charge people, but I think that's a good sort of base idea of where you kind of want, at least where you might want to put your price point, as well as where I think I put mine. Now again, these tips are not an absolute. This is just how I approach things. Well, yes, I probably could be charging more for my work. I do find that I'd rather put my work at a slightly cheaper price point just to be able to get it in more people's hands. Not everybody's willing to spend several $1,000s on paintings. I have to kind of be reasonable about where you're putting your work, where it's selling, and who are the kind of people that are the ones buying your work. I find that most of the time my work's going to fairly regular people, just people with fairly solid day jobs that have a little extra cash to burn, so they want to hang something cool on their walls, and that's kind of where my market sits. Now, way back in the day when I had, I think, a Blogspot account, and I was just starting to throw some artwork on there, I used a slogan that was something along the lines of art for the common man, because I never wanted there to be a huge price barrier between getting my work into people's hands. And that's sort of a mentality I've adopted through my work, and I still practice today, though I don't really use the slogan. So if you're going to be pricing your work, I think in the grand scheme of all of the tips I suggested, I have 3 that you probably should remember, if nothing else. Be honest, be reasonable, and be realistic. So what do you guys think? Is this a fairly reasonable way to price artwork, or have I forgotten something, or maybe gone a little too far? Or have I gotten you to think about maybe some factors that you haven't considered when putting that price tag on your work? Be sure to let me know your thoughts in comments below. Check out the description box for social links to things like my Facebook fan page, DeviantArt, Instagram, my own website, as well as the community Discord. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this. Helps the video out as always. Keep on creating. This has been from Cinderblock Studios, and I will see you guys next time. Well, that only took 3 tries. Perfect.